This morning we're talking about running uphill. One of the meanings of that expression is to go against the tide of popular opinion. Well, that best describes Judith Trustone's life. She's a writer and a teacher with a cause that not everyone agrees with, and that's just fine with her. In fact, the more opposition she faces, the harder she works.
Well, I've always been active in civil rights, the women's movement, the peace movement, but I never really got involved with prisons because they seem so impenetrable and difficult. And I had my own prejudices about prisoners, just like most people do. I thought, oh well, they must have done something. And I really did think that the system worked. However, the more I got into it, the more I realized it doesn't work. I wake up at dawn and I meditate for an hour. And then I read the paper. I then go on the internet and I read the New York Times, the Washington Post, and about 6 alternative news sources so that I really get a sense of what's going on in the world. And I also send out jokes. I think it's important to keep laughing. Although it's not much is funny about prisons, life is funny. Anyway, I was reading the newspaper and I read an article about this man, James Taylor, who had transformed himself in prison. And I was so touched by the story, I thought, I'm going to write a letter. And I often have that impulse and rarely act on it. But in this situation, I thought, let me do this. And I managed to get a copy of the letter to him, and he invited me to come to Graterford to do a workshop. So I was curious. I'm a writer. I'm always looking for, interesting backgrounds and stories. And so I went expecting just to get an experience of being in a maximum security prison. When I walked into the room and I looked around at these guys, they were all in the uniforms and stuff, and all but 2 of them were black, and it was like, oh, these are real people sitting here. These weren't like anonymous prisoners. And then I kept coming back. They wanted me to come back. And over time, I was hired to teach creative writing. Eventually, as they began to open up to me, and I began to open up to them, 4 of the 15 of my students claimed innocence, and I thought, with the usual stereotypical response, oh, right, everybody in prison says they're innocent. So I said, show me. And darned if they didn't. They showed me evidence of their innocence, and I read their cases, and I talked with lawyers about it, and found out why they were stuck in prison, and what the laws were that they couldn't appeal their cases and that kind of thing. And the one, I guess, that really had the most power was Muti. And Muti wasn't even there when the crime was committed. One of the guys who did the crime implicated him in order to get a shorter sentence for himself. He's been out for years. Muti, who wasn't even there and didn't even do anything, is spending his life in prison. And so his was the first story that I tried to compile. And out of that story grew the book, Sailing America's Soul, Torture and Transformation in Our Prisons. When the prison officials knew that I was working on the book, they began to harass me, and I began to experience just a tiny bit of what they go through every single day. They would go through every scrap of paper and question me. They wouldn't escort me back to the classroom for like an hour, and the class was an hour and a half long. And they just made it increasingly difficult for me to teach. And then finally one day, when I went in, they wanted me to submit to a full body search, which meant stripping and bending over and having people put their fingers into my body. And I said, no, you can't do that. That's rape. I will not permit it. I quit. I felt so powerless against a system that was so cruel. It's like Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo are happening in this country all the time. So that's what kind of my passion is, to wake people up to what's going on. But I have met the most extraordinary human beings behind bars. Their ability to endure the daily psychological and often physical torture and brutality that they're surrounded by, and still be loving and creative just gives me tremendous inspiration. There are some very, very good people in prison. My hope is that by allowing them to have a human voice, for people to read their books and to see into their souls, we'll begin to change our attitudes towards prisoners.
What began as a simple visit to a maximum security prison to teach creative writing has changed Judith's life. If you'd like to find out more about Sagewriters, please log on to our New Morning website at faithstreams.com.